In this short video, we're just going to have a look at the workspace for Blender. So Blender's a 3D creation program and also a 3D animation and special effects program. For the project that we're working on, we're just going to mainly focus on the modeling function because we'll be taking our assets that we create in Blender into Unity for the third assessment for what we're working on. I've just opened up Blender at the moment. You'll notice this initial loading screen has appeared. I'm using version 2.83. It's slightly different from the version that we're using in school, which is 2.8, but they work pretty much exactly the same way. If you're working at home and have downloaded it, you may well have downloaded a even more recent version of the software. And for this video, we'll just have a look at some of the locations of some of the tools that we're going to be working with Blender. I'm going to click away from this window because I've already got a 3D object inside my workspace or my scene. So in 3D, the workspace is often referred to as the scene. That cube is just sitting there. I just want to go around and show you the various parts of the screen that we're looking at. I'm going to start up here on the top left-hand side. And what you'll see here is that I'm in this thing called object mode at the moment. And object mode is what we use to add new meshes or new objects into our workspace, and also lets us manipulate them in subtle ways like move them around and rotate them and maybe scale them using these tools which are found down the left-hand side. So the initial tool selected is the select box, and that lets me to click on and click off different objects. We have this thing called the 3D cursor or the cursor, and the cursor is basically the location. If I click here and make a new object, then that object will appear where the cursor is rather than in the center of the existing object. Next tool is move, which allows me to manipulate and move around the object around. We have a rotation, we have a scale, and we have a transform option, which is kind of all three of those things together. And I'll go over how they work in a little bit more detail in another video. You'll notice I've talked about we're working in object mode, and the other mode that we'll be mainly working in for our project is edit mode. So you can click between them here, or you can just use the tab key on the keyboard, and that will allow that option to happen. Moving over to the right hand side, we have some tools up here, and probably the most important tool is the viewport. That's actually what we see, and you'll notice up here there's X, Y, and Z. Those are the axes that we work in. So X is the width, Y is the height, and Z is the depth. We're working in 3 dimensions, and we can use this to, if we click on them, if I click on the X, it will move to what we call an orthographic view. So I'm just seeing it from the side on. If I click on Y, it will do the same thing. You might not notice too much of a change because we're working with a square, so it looks the same from every side, and Z will take me to the thing called the Z axis. We can also rotate around the object when we're in a perspective mode, and you can do that just by holding down the center scroll wheel on the mouse. Hold it down and just move your mouse, which I'm doing now, and that will allow me to orbit and move around. If I turn the scroll wheel, that lets me zoom in and out, and if I hold down the shift key and push in the scroll wheel, I can do a thing called a pan, where I can pan across to different objects. So that's what the viewport lets me do here in the top right corner. Beside the viewport is the scene properties, and that's really important because it allows us to control the objects that we have in our scene. And at the moment you can see there are actually 3 objects in the scene. It's like this for any new Blender file that you create. It will actually create a cube to start with. You can see that the cube is noted there. You'll also notice there's a camera, and the camera is kind of the viewport that we look through. I've just clicked on the camera inside the properties, and you'll notice over here on the screen it's been highlighted. The camera is essentially the viewport you can see when you render. And then we also have a light, which is providing illumination, which would help with things like shading. Now again, we're just going to be using Blender mainly for modeling. We're not going to be rendering or worrying too much about lights. That's what we'll be doing in Unity. And finally, we have our cube here, which is the object that we're working with. Below the scene properties, we have all the extra settings that we can work with the object or the item that we have. And you can see here, I'm just looking at my object properties for my selected object. In this case, it's the cube. And it tells me things like the scale. And if I start playing with these, I'm actually manipulating the size of the cube. It lets me directly modify it, and I can do things like rotate it, and that's rotating some of the properties of it. So the transform properties over here under the properties dialog is pretty much the same as the tools over there on the left hand side. You can use either or. It kind of makes no difference to the way that you manipulate your object, so work with what's most comfortable with you. If you do want to know what all the tools do, you can just hover the arrow over the tools and it will actually tell you what the particular tool will do. Render properties. Mainly we want to look at the object properties, and also we're going to be looking at modifier properties a little bit later on, and we can have a look at things like the data properties and things like that. So these are all kind of interesting things, but pretty much we're going to be using the object properties, and we'll be adding modifier properties to what we work with Blender. So it's really important when you first start to use any piece of software, you kind of get comfortable where things are. So we have our object in the center, we have our tools that we can use on the left hand side, and then we have our properties with the list of all the content inside the scene that we're working with, and then we have the things we can modify down below it. And if you follow along with that, it should be pretty easy to work with Blender for creating your 3D models.